Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being on the call. And want to thank Caitlin Bellina, our wonderful colleague, who's our Zoom master. Want to thank Bob Kahn and Wendy Landon and their colleagues and the Vision Committee, thinking about how we can connect people to our synagogue. And I want to thank all of you for being on the call this morning. So we know what our project is. Our project is that here we are, 3 weeks out from Pesach, and it's going to be the second year in a row of a Zoom-type Seder, the second year in a row of a socially distanced Seder, which is not what any of us would want. And the question is, how can we channel the pain and the brokenness and the sadness of that 2 years in a row of Zoom Seders into deeply meaningful Seders? So what I want to do in about the first 45 minutes of our class is I want to just show you an example of how the Haggadah itself speaks directly to this issue, and how using commentaries you can just extract so much meaning. This is not going to be a lecture, this is going to be a conversation. And so the way it will work for the first 45 minutes, I'm just going to kind of frame up the issue, going to look at the commentaries, and then I would very much love a conversation where those who want to contribute their thoughts would just send a message in the chat function to my friend Caitlin Bellina over here. Caitlin will let me know that you'd like to say something, and that way we can have an actual conversation going that could be something like the conversation you have around your smaller Seder table or your Zoom Seder. So here is, let's just get right into it. If you look on page 1 of the handout that I sent you, and I think, Caitlin, you can also share a screen here. On page 1, you see that the Haggadah quotes a verse from Deuteronomy. This is from Ki Tavo. This is where the farmer comes with the farmer's basket of fruits and says, oh my God, God, you are just amazing. You fulfill your promise. I am a farmer, but I am a descendant of a people that has a story, begins with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. My father was a wandering Aramean, and then we were enslaved. It was really hard in slavery. And then in the course of that proclamation that this farmer now makes, bearing fruit, that they've arrived to Israel and they're living as free people now all these years later, the farmer says, Vayishma Adonai et kolenu. God heard our voice. And then it quotes, this is in the bottom of page 1, God heard their moans. God remembered the divine covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. This is just so important. I want to just double click here. What is this saying? Yes, that, we all know, and now I think, Caitlin, we can go back to the screen. We all know that eventually God wakes up and God hears and God sends the 10 plagues and God sends Moses and Aaron and they get freed. But what that neglects to mention is that for 430 years, the Israelites lived and died as slaves. So that's a lot of generations of slavery. And the obvious question that our commentary is going to deal with is, why does it take so long? Where was God? And how do we understand God's absence? And how do we understand the suffering that never gets redeemed? Because you could say it's delayed, not denied. In the big scheme of history, they eventually get out. And that's true if you happen to be lucky enough to be born in one of those later generations. But it doesn't give a balm to those who were born into slavery, lived as slaves, and died as slaves. Two obvious examples that come to mind of this problem, and then we're going to get into the commentary and the conversation with all of you on the call. Think about the Shoah and the state of Israel. So it's kind of mainstream Jewish theology to say that God is behind the creation of the state of Israel. I mean, we say it every Saturday morning, Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. And religious Zionists definitely see the hand of God in the founding of the state of Israel in 1948, like there's the hand of God and the outstretched arm in the 10 plagues that free us. Only problem is 430 years of slavery, where was God? Only problem is the 6 million, where was God? Now, in our own time, we kind of also have that. Like, oh my God, yes, finally there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Vaccine rollout is happening, more than 1 million a day. Eventually, we'll all get vaccinated. Light at the end of the tunnel. Eventually, we'll recover. But what about the 500,000 American citizens who died? What about the millions who died worldwide? Where was God for them? So that is the question that we're trying to address in this piece of the Seder. So I want to now just go to if you look on page 2, these are some modern thinkers who are going to kind of deal with this issue that delayed, not denied, isn't really true. It is actually denied. For the people who died as slaves, it was denied. Where was God? And now they're gonna talk about it. So the first one is Rebekah Neuberger Goldstein. This is in the wonderful Haggadah that's edited by Jonathan Safran Foer, the New American Haggadah. And now I'm just going to read a little bit, and then I want to get your comments here, because each one of these takes is so evocative and juicy and can give rise to so much conversation today. We're on page 2 of the handout. Kafka once wrote in his journal, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That is something you are free to do, and it accords with your nature. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. The you that Kafka is addressing might be himself, or it might be each of us. But it could also be, and here's the stunner, the God of Exodus himself. It accords with his nature too, to hold himself back from the sufferings of the world." So, here's the first take, and the application of this issue from Rebekah Neuberger Goldstein to our lives is obvious. All this suffering is happening out there, but if you are lucky enough to have a job that you can do at home virtually, if you're lucky enough to be able to use Instacart or some home delivery service, you could actually never leave your house. You could be pretty safe. You could be held back from the sufferings of the world. So let me invite some thoughts, comments, and questions. If you were running your Seder and we're kind of working this issue through, what kinds of things might you say? I think this just speaks so directly. And by the way, I mean, you know this if you've been following our services. Every Shabbos we'll have Aliyot, and virtually every family says, "I feel blessed. We're safe, we're healthy. Our loved ones are safe, are healthy. Our children are safe, are healthy. Our grandchildren are safe and healthy." And they make a bracha, and they're grateful. We are able to hold ourselves back from the suffering of the world. Let me invite anyone who wishes to comment on Rebekah Neuberger Goldstein's take on God's delay. Anybody? So I'll throw out a question. Should we feel guilty? Should we feel guilty? I mean, all the comments about, "Oh, I'm blessed." Are we kind of pulling a God in the in the sense that we're kind of sleeping on all the sorrow? So I've got one comment from Roxanne Kelber. Would love to hear your thoughts, and then Roxanne, and then Wendy Landon. Roxanne, I'd love to hear you.
Okay, thank you. I've actually been thinking about this, I think, for several years, because in the Haggadah, so much is ascribed to God, right? We're thanking God and we're praising God for the miracles, for so many things that have happened. And it has always been said to me that the role of Moses was downplayed because we kind of don't want to make a God out of Moses. The focus has to be on God. And I've come to think it's such a big mistake. We hold God accountable for things that go right and for everything that doesn't go right. And I think here was an example of the exodus of a man who was inspired by injustice. He was inspired at the treatment of other slaves. he was also inspired spiritually by God in terms of how he behaved. But it was humanity that also, in partnership with God, led us out of Egypt. And so when we hold so much onto only God, it is a mystery anymore why in the Haggadah we keep so much focus on God and we don't include the role of a person in leading us out of a bad situation, a tragic situation. And to me, it's a mistake. And then there we go all the time, ascribing things to God, blessing God, da da da, when maybe what we have to do is be thankful for science. And yes, it can be used for good and evil. It's like everything, right? That we look at. And so people can be spiritually and godly inspired, but it isn't God who created the vaccines. It's man, it's people, it's women. And so a focus all along in our lives, I think gets us into trouble all the time, you know?
Roxanne, that's so rich and that's so evocative, and it's so what a beautiful. Let's just pause on your point, because I just think it's so perfect for a great Seder conversation, which is it is the case that the Haggadah deliberately omits Moses. Right? If you read the book of Exodus, Moses is in every page. If you read the Haggadah, Moses is not there. And the classic answer is it's about God, not about Moses. But your point, Roxanne, is just so rich. And do we want to say it's about God and not Moses? Do we want to say how much? And let's think about the partnership and where was God and where is God and where are we and where are humans? I think that is a really beautiful point of departure and would make a very rich conversation, Roxanne. Thank you. Wendy Landon, you had something you wanted to say.
So I was thinking before you said it, Wes, I feel guilty all the time that we get to sit here in our house on Zoom meetings all day. I think of my family, my mom, my grandparents who are always in retail. What would we have done if I were a little girl and all of a sudden there were no jobs? And I think what this moment has done for me is I'm incredibly thankful, but I'm incredibly thankful for all the people out there, for the supermarket workers, for the people that are helping us get fed, for the delivery people. And I think what this has done for me is realize that we're in an interconnected world, and that, as going back to the Haggadah with Exodus, it's not we're thankful for God, we're thankful for things that we have, but we have to work together and thank each other as a community to get to where we need to be.
And Wendy, that what you just said, what does it incline you to want to do? If you were to internalize what you just said, how would you want to act any differently?
Yeah, so I mean, it has absolutely changed our philanthropic giving to different causes. I am, every time I go to the supermarket, I'm thanking those people, I'm chatting with them, I'm asking them how they are, and really trying to care and connect rather than usually just, got to get out of there, got to get to my meeting. And so just really noticing people in a way that I hadn't before.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. I think one of the rich resonances of your words is if we can channel or tap into what Rebekah Neuberger Goldstein is talking about, that we are, in a sense, holding ourselves back from the suffering of the world because we're on Zoom meetings all day. We're not out in public. We're not driving the buses. We're not in the subway. We're not at the checkout counter. We're not with people exposed, and we feel guilty about it. Is there some healthy outlet for that guilt? Is there some healthy outlet for that realization, hey, we've been blessed to hold back. What can we do to be helpful? So good. Okay, I want to move to Lemony Snicket, who is the second speaker on this page. He makes such an evocative comment. God, who supposedly knows everything, needs to be reminded of a promise, right? Because take a look again at what the Haggadah line is. God heard our voice, just as it says in Exodus, God heard their moans and God remembered the divine covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as if to suggest that before the moans God had forgotten. Like, you know what? Oops, that covenant. Oops, it kind of slipped my mind. Right? So God had forgotten. So now let's keep going. So he says, God, who supposedly knows everything, needs to be reminded of a promise he made with our ancestors. This is disconcerting, a word which here means cause for much argument among rabbis and peasants alike, but not surprising. And here we go. All of us have forgotten about promises we have made, even promises that are very important to us and that are still very important to the people to whom we've promised them. Now, this is just rich as all get out. And Caitlin, we can take the screen now. Forgotten promises. How could you develop the theme of promises forgotten and perhaps hopefully remembered at this year's Seder table? Any thoughts, comments, questions? And put in a chat. While you're marinating on whether you want to contribute, let me just say, for my money, the most important book written about our country in my lifetime is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. If you read Caste with an open mind, you simply will not look at our country the same way. You simply will not. You cannot. And one of the things that she points out about Caste is that, you know, the promise that all people are created equal, that's a promise. All people are created equal, and that is a promise that has been too long forgotten. And the question is, can we remember it? Bob Kahn, would love to hear your thoughts.
So I was thinking that, you know, around the high holidays, we all do a lot of self-reflecting and we make a lot of promises to ourselves about all the things that we're going to be doing for the year. Maybe they're get involved with social justice issues, you know, be a better person, work on this, that, and the other thing. You kind of make a whole bunch of promises to yourself. And then as the year progresses, you know, life overtakes you, and you find yourself back at the next set of high holidays thinking about the same things and what you should have done during the prior year. So I think, you know, the challenge is how do we remind ourselves of the promises that we make to ourselves in terms of, you know, mitzvot and doing good things, and also being mindful, like what Wendy talked about, is, you know, when you interact with somebody, you know, whether it be in the store or whatever, to you know, be able to keep in mind that, you know, this is a human being and they may be suffering, and even though you're kind of, again, overwhelmed by your daily life, how do you keep that top of mind? That's kind of the ongoing challenge.
Bob, I love what you say. You know, first of all, this is just the idea, the theme of forgotten promises could definitely be taken at the national level, but very deeply and very importantly at the personal level. And it is worth noting, you know, and you talk about the promises we make to ourselves around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and then life gets in the way, that actually the beginning of the year, the first month of the year, is Nisan coming up, right? So, you know, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is midway point of the year. The new Nisan is the first month of the year. And so we really have 2 New Years, at month 6 and at month 12, you know, month 1. And this is an opportunity to do your own check-in for accountability. You know, how am I doing vis-a-vis my own goals, my own aspirations, my own promises? How can I hold myself accountable for the person that I want to be? And where's the work to be done that still needs to be done? Thank you, Bob. Paul Wessel, would love your thoughts. Paul, if you can unmute, please.
Okay, I want to reflect on your comment that the Declaration of Independence's promise was that all people are created equal, when in fact that is our modern sensibility. We would like to believe that that's what it said, but it is not what it said. Its promise was that all white Christian men are created equal. And we have to remember that the reason why the promise that we believe should be fulfilled has never been fulfilled is the original intent was to separate everybody else out and to keep white Christian men as the ones who were created equal.
Paul, thank you. So obviously that's another very different kind of conversation. You know, Bob's conversation would tend towards a personal one about personal accountability. Your conversation, Paul, is also rich in a very different way. You know, what kind of country do we want to have now? And how does that sync up with, you know, the original documents of the founders and of the framers? So all of those would make for a very lively conversation. Let me move to our third speaker, our third thinker. This, I just love this. This is Jeffrey Goldberg, who's a big thinker. And he has a different take on God forgets. God forgets, a shocking idea. God chose us and then forgot us. Now here's where he goes. Only by wailing did we remind him of our existence. But God's problem is our problem as well. We're masters of forgetting about prejudice and unfairness, wars and genocides, hunger and misery. We're busy, we're overwhelmed, we're callous. So what reminds us of injustice in the world? Wailing, protest, complaining. Suffering in silence is not a Jewish virtue. Complaining is a Jewish virtue. Okay? Complaining is a Jewish virtue. So I think what Jeffrey Goldberg is inviting us to think about are the ways in which complaining and dissent and dissension, even anger, can be distinctly Jewish and helpful and productive, right? Which is an interesting take because there's so much unrest in our society now. There's so much cacophony in our society now. There's so much dissonance in our society now. There's so much complaining in our society now. And Jeffrey Goldberg is inviting us to think about the ways in which all of that negative energy is actually positive energy. Thoughts, comments, and questions. What would you do with that? I'll just try to suggest, oh, we got Roxanne. Roxanne, I'll take love your thoughts again.
So I think we have I'm sure many countries have a wonderful tradition of protest, whether it's peaceful protest or not. In our own tradition, in our own state of Israel, we have that as well. But in our country now, we don't just have complaining, we have hatred. And we have a lot of articulation and behaviors of hatred, which is really different than suffering and complaining. And it's certainly not clear to me that underlying that hatred is always suffering. I think that there was an assumption maybe that was true. That was all part of, I think, the old, do we need to listen more? And I thought, no. I mean, in fomenting of World War II, did we need to listen more? I think we needed to protest more the hatred that we were hearing. So I think there really needs to be a distinction, especially in what's going on now, between suffering, anger, problems that need to be identified, and unleashing pure anger and hatred at whatever.
Okay, thank you, Roxanne. Now, the distinction between what was happening on January 6th was not the kind of productive complaining. And the question is, what does productive complaining as compared to hatred look like? Thank you, Roxanne. Ruth Addis. And if you can unmute, please, Ruth.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sometimes complaining is not objecting to something, it's explaining. It's explaining one's feelings, one's interpretations of something. The deep thoughts within is being done verbally by explaining
Mm,
when it's received as complaining.
mm. Thank you. Thank you. Steve Thompson.
My question, Wes, is that did God really forget? He told Abraham all the way back in Genesis that, that he said that this was going to happen, that his people would, be enslaved for suffering for 430 years. The question is, did they really suffer? Our rabbis teach us that for the first half of the 400 years that we were in Egypt, there actually things were good. And then things got bad after Pharaoh died and the new Pharaoh came up and didn't know about Joseph. And as things got really bad, not until they really got bad and the people started complaining, did God respond to them. So the question is, did he really forget, or was he waiting to see at what level would these people, after their good times in Egypt, would they really respond? The same thing can be said for what's happening in our time. A year ago, and before the pandemic began, we here, at least in the United States, for the most part, our economy was good, things were good, and people were not complaining. Not about political, but I'm talking about economically and now. And once the pandemic hit, then all of a sudden we were thrown for a loop. And how did we respond? And things got so bad. People were distant socially. And that things got bad more politically and economically. And then people started to really realize we have to do something about this. We have to mask, we have to social distance. And then when the vaccine finally started to come out, people started to feel a sense of hope. So my point is that it's just that, when things are good, we don't really seek out God. But when things get really rough, all of a sudden we do cry out. And, God does answer. We may not look at it that way, but I think the provision of the vaccine, the vaccinations coming out from different companies is really, I think, one way that God might answer us.
Mm. Thank you, Steve. Beautifully said. So I think this whole theme of complaining is a Jewish virtue, and when we complain and what prompts our complaints, and when is complaining productive versus hateful, I think that's very rich, both, again, at the national level and at the personal, emotional level, both with regards to, race and justice and equity, with regards to health and economics. It's just this theme of complaining is a Jewish virtue, and when do we complain and what do we complain about, I think is super rich. I want to close. Our last speaker is just also so rich, Nathaniel Deutsch. The most theologically shocking moment in Exodus is not when God appears in the burning bush or splits the Sea of Reeds, or even when he gives the Ten Commandments at Sinai. It is when God remembers his covenant with Israel. How can a God who was so close at hand in Genesis that he spoke directly to Abraham, overheard Sarah's laughing, wrestled with Jacob, how can he be so far away when their descendants are enslaved in Egypt? The pshat, or the plain sense of Exodus, suggests an answer that is both simple and horrifying. God, who spent the better part of Genesis cultivating the people of Israel, has, by only the second chapter of Exodus, forgotten that they are his nation, and therefore his responsibility. Hence, stripped bare lies the theological root of one of the deepest fears in the collective Jewish psyche, the fear of forgetting and being forgotten. Being forgotten, being not seen, being not valued, being forgotten. How would you develop that super rich theme? The theme of being forgotten. Any takers? Jeff and Ellen Fredberg.
Yeah. One thing is about complaining is one sort of thing, and all the things we've commented so far is kind of focused on us. But before the pandemic, someone just mentioned things were really, really good. Well, they weren't good for everybody. There was a whole part of our society that was suffering and continues to suffer. And it really took something like the pandemic as a kind of great leveler for us to become sensitized to how much they're suffering, because we're getting a little taste of that ourselves. And I think we didn't listen well. So part of complaining is one thing, but listening and hearing is something else. And I think maybe some of us hear the pain of those parts of the society that are in the wrong zip codes. We hear their pain a little more.
Thank you, Jeff. You know, I'll just share with you very personally that this year, which is my 59th of existence, I really had an epiphany that was deeper than any I've had in my life, about my life and about my country. I realized only at age 59 that I was white. I never thought I was white before. I always thought I was Jewish. And my story was a story of the people that survived Adolf Hitler, but 1/3 of our people was wiped out by Hitler. My story was the Jewish people's story of the most oppressed, most despised, most scorned, most decimated, most pogromized, most massacred people in history. 1/3 perished while the world slept, and then Israel, and here in America. And that was my story. And I never actually got that that's true. All that's true. But it's also true that white Jews in America are the direct recipients of white privilege. And the reason that we're able to be so successful here is we're white. And I never got that until I read the book Caste. And I'm trying to work that through because I never saw all those other zip codes. And not only that, but I remember when my daughter was 17 and she went to a program in Dorchester and she said, "Dad, we have white privilege." I was just irate with her. I said, "White privilege, what a crazy thing. Jews work hard to get to where they go. They work hard." And she says, "Yeah, we do work hard, but our hard work can be rewarded because we're white in a country that privileges that." Now, caste is not for everybody. I'm not trying to be a, evangelist for that. What I'm saying is when we think about who's forgotten and being forgotten and who remembers and who's being remembered, I do think that we're on the cusp of a new awareness in the Jewish world, at least of some Jews, who realize that while the narrative of Jewish persecution and oppression is 100% true, that is true, and there's another narrative, which is that we have been able to be successful in this country because we're white. That is also true. And so I think that is more for those, again, you can always go just purely personal in your Seders, and God bless if you do. But I think that's some ferment that at least I'm working through, and what's the response to that? I'm working through that. And Sebastian.
I appreciate your profound honesty and epiphany, and yes, definitely, being white helps in attaining privilege, but I think that it's easy to forget that what is called white skin privilege doesn't apply to all whites. And if we start to think about a group that most of us, I would venture all of us, passionately disagree with, the white supremacists, a lot of it is because they have not attained the privilege, because they've been forgotten in one way, shape, or form, or they believe they've been forgotten. And so I think we have to be very careful when we take on that mantle of realizing that not even among all white Jews has the privilege been attained.
And thank you. That's a very helpful corrective. And it is certainly true that, deaths of despair are highest among whites. That's absolutely true. So let me just break for now with a closing comment, and then we're going to go into break rooms. I think that this little exercise illustrates that there's an expression of 70 faces of Torah, Shivim Panim LaTorah. You could have a completely worthy Seder. Just talking about all these issues at a personal level, kind of connected to the spirit of Bob Kahn's comments about the promises we make to ourselves to be a better person on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and that by Pesach, life has gotten in the way, and how do we hold ourselves accountable? And that's entirely valid. And or we could have a conversation at the level of our nation. There's obviously the issues that we all know about: race, justice, equity, healthcare, education, economic opportunity, infrastructure, caste, etc., privilege. That is valid. They're both valid. They're both valid. They're different. Personal accountability is different from national accountability, but they're both different. Maybe that's why God gives us two different nights for the Seder here in America. In any event, here's what I want to say, and then we'll go off to the breakout room. You know that the point of a Seder is not just to read the lines from the Maxwell House Haggadah. The point of a Seder is to get into it. The point of a Seder is to let the lines of the Haggadah prompt a conversation about real stuff. The real stuff could be personal. The real stuff could be national. The real stuff could be about the Jewish people. But the Seder achieves its maximum purpose when the lines of the Haggadah are a way to connect with the real world as it is. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take 10 minutes. And my friend Caitlin is going to just kind of arbitrarily divide us up into breakout rooms so that in the context of 10 people, you can talk to each other and whatever comes to mind, it's chef's choice, whatever comes to mind. And then in 10 minutes, we'll come back and we'll close. Thank you, Caitlin. Okay, guys, so what I want to do, we have 10 minutes left for an on-time conclusion at 11 o'clock. I want to just take 3 minutes real quick and just hear a report from the field about folks who just tell me what it was like to talk in a group of 6, 8, 10 people. Anybody want to just share what that was like? I want to just popcorn unpack what just happened and what that was like. And if you're willing to share, please send a message to the chat function and Caitlin will let me know. Anyone? Wendy Landon.
So we spoke about, we tried to be directed, but we spoke about our takeaways from the session, how meaningful it was, and specifically tried to address how we might include it and change our Seders this year. And everyone had a different mix of Seders. Some were going to be doing small groups in person who had been vaccinated, a mix of Zoom and in person, all Zoom. And so we just talked about our takeaways and how especially promises made, promises that we've broken to ourselves for the upcoming year has really resonated with people. And this might be a good year to take stock of what's meaningful and what we need to do in the future. And we talked a lot about the complaining issue, and was it complaining versus not satisfied with the status quo, and how do we push ourselves to continue to strive for better.
Wendy, thank you. Thank you so much. Ruth Nemzoff. And Ruth Nemzoff, if you could please unmute.
Sorry. Our group came up with an idea for Temple Emmanuel, which is the following. There are many people in the congregation who don't have the Seder with anyone this year, or maybe they don't have progeny. And so how could we connect all those people together, not just at the big Seder for the second night, but in small groups for the first night? Some may want a discussion group just that night. Others may want a full Seder. But what is the role of the temple and individuals in it? And if you don't have progeny, how you could share this with people from other cultures.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ruth. That's a really good project. Thank you. Let's think about that. Ruth Cope.
Yes, I actually would like to speak. We had a small group, as everyone did, and I'd like to say it was only in the beginning because we want to say hello, what we usually do, what we could take from this wonderful discussion to apply and how to do that. But we only got like to the first semicolon. We really need a few more discussions so that we can open it up. And for me, you know, I didn't know everyone who was in the group. So I want to say, hello, who are you? What are you doing? And where are you from? And that kind of thing, the curiosity. So it's a wonderful thing to break into small groups. I'd love for them to be longer. I'd love for this discussion to be longer. And I thank you so much.
Thank you. So Ruth, let me just pivot off of that. That's just natural energy for the following point. I would love it if, I think we had about 140 folks on this call this morning. I have one ask for each of you, which is to Ruth Cope's point, let's keep the conversations going. And here's very simple what I would like to ask you to do. Email Terry Swartz Russell or email me, I'm Wes Garden Swartz, email either of us, and just say, I'm in. And what you're in for is you're gonna participate in a small learning group. And the only nuance here is, do you wanna be a participant in the small learning group, or do you want to be a leader in the small learning group? That's it. Say, yes, dear Wes, dear Terry, yes, I am in. I want to be a member of a small learning group at Temple Emmanuel. And I want to be a leader, or I just want to be a participant. I don't want to be a leader, but I'll come and I'll learn. Just do that. And then what we're going to do is we are going to create groups of about 10 people. And then we'll put the groups together. And then also the first session of every one of these groups is going to be launched by a clergy, either me or Michelle or Eliza or Elias or Dan. We're going to launch you. And then you can continue the conversation and make it whatever you want. But I can't think of a better response to the shutting down of our world, you know, on March 13th, than the efflorescence of small learning groups that are continuing the conversation. Terry Swartz Russell.
I just wanted, somebody just asked this, I wanted to clarify. It's not really being a group leader, it's really being the convener. So you're going to be the facilitator, you're going to make sure that you pick a date and that you get people together. And then just like today, when we were in different groups, different people are going to lead the discussion and are going to take, everybody's going to get a chance to take a part and be part of, and sort of direct where the conversation's going based on the people in your group. So don't feel like you are now the leader, the teacher, the whatever. Okay, so it's not so threatening. And it's just saying, I will make sure that the 10 people or the 8 people or however many people are in our group do come together at least once or twice, and let's see where it goes.
Right. So let me just ask you, make our day by sending an email to Terry and or to me saying, yes, we're in. We want to do small learning groups. And what a beautiful thing that in this challenging season, our response is figuring out a way to have really deeply meaningful conversations. Let me just close out by asking, there's 2 last folks who had offered to generously share. Ned Holstein, would love to hear your voice.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I could turn this off because it's echoing. Sorry for the feedback. I just wanted to say briefly that I heard some very interesting discussion about upcoming Pesach, but I'm, instead of wailing and worrying about being forgotten and promises unkept, I see Pesach differently. I see it as a celebration that's mandated in Exodus 14 that says, this is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival. And we have other times for the wailing, the moaning. We have Tisha B'Av, we have Rosh Hashanah, we have Yom Kippur. I see Pesach as the most powerful liberation metaphor in history that has profoundly affected in a positive way the Western world.
Ned, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Amen to that. Love that. And Sis Casas, you got the last word, my friend.
If you want me to respond, I thought that our session was very good. And of course, I listened quietly. I thought when they talked about humility, how important that was for all of us. For me, particularly, to see that my ability to handle the entire event for all this time was because of all the others around me who were able to provide my food, my goods, my safety, my vaccination, and all the way through. And I'm very grateful for everyone who was took a part in having me survive in such a well orchestrated moment.
Sis, thank you for that. What a beautiful note to end on. Listen, I think there's actually a real flip side to the challenge of this moment, which is that all this challenge creates the opportunity for ever deeper meaning and connection and gratitude. It's the flip side. And so let's work together to create seders of deep meaning, but conversations of deep meaning, learning of deep meaning, relationships of deep meaning. That is the best response that we could possibly make to this moment. So make our day, send us an email saying you're in, and we're going to launch these small learning groups. We'll be a community of Torah and connection and meaning making. Thank you all. I want to thank David Beckman and Caitlin Bellina for making this whole conversation possible. Again, want to thank Wendy and Bob Kahn for the initiative, and want to thank all of you for making this happen. Lots of love, guys. Have a good day. Thank you.